Good afternoon. I'm Kataria faculty and coordinator of the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program. I have the pleasure of warmly welcoming you to our homecoming weekend and to our exciting alumni panel. Thank you for your participation and support of ADS. It really means a great deal to all of us. I would like to thank the ADS Steering Committee, our co-sponsors, PASDI, APASA, and APASIC, and the University of Development Alumni Relations, and the LNS Development Office, particularly Susan, Danielle, Lorraine, Tara, Hajid, and Kelly, for their support in making this event possible. There is no question that we are living in one of the most challenging times, a pandemic that is devastating, not only in terms of the losses of lives and livelihood, but also of what it reveals about our society, the persisting inequities and widening social and racial fault lines that are testing our moral fabric. We are also on the eve of some momentous developments, the elections and the Supreme Court nomination, that will fundamentally shape national discourse on critical issues and, by extension, our society, our nation, and the future that we will leave for posterity. Asian American studies emerged 50 years ago from a historical moment of rupture and of possibility. Many of the issues that both challenge and inspired us to envision a more inclusive and just society continue to inform the intellectual and political projects of our faculty and students today. Our three alumni panelists exemplify that sustained engagement with questions of justice, equity, and inclusion that are foundational to Asian American studies. Before we begin the presentations, I would like to make just a very quick logistical announcement. We have disabled the chat feature for this event, but we definitely welcome your questions for the panelists. So if you do have a question or a comment, please post it to the Q&A stream. And please be sure to get your questions and comments in by 3 p.m. I now turn this over to my colleague, Professor Lok Soo, who will introduce our panelists and moderate the session. Once again, thank you for your presence at this event, and I hope you enjoy the wonderful presentations.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lok Soo, also from the Asian American Asian Diaspora Studies program. I'm the associate professor there, and I'm also the chair of the Senate Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Campus Climate. I'm very pleased to be introducing our three distinguished panelists. We have our first speaker will be Tu Quoc, who received her PhD in 2009. She is currently serving as the Chief Deputy of Administration at Asian Health Services, a federally qualified health center in Oakland that serves 50,000 patients in English and 14 other Asian languages. She has been working in public health and healthcare for over 2 decades. Her research, service, and advocacy work have been grounded in her own lived experience as a refugee from Vietnam and the struggles of her family faced in the health care system. As an epidemiologist, Dr. Quoc is leading the organization in addressing racial disparities in COVID-19, including starting up a culturally and linguistically competent community testing site and contact tracing targeting AAPIs. Her talk for today is Understanding the Needs and Impacts of COVID-19 in the Asian American community. Our second speaker, which will follow Dr. Quoc, will be Annie Fukushima. She is a graduate of our PhD program from 2012. Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima is an assistant professor in ethnic studies at the University of Utah. She's the author of the award-winning book, Migrant Crossings, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the United States, which received the Asia and Asian American Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Dr. Fukushima is also the project lead and co-principal investigator for the research project titled Visualizing Gender-Based Violence. Her talk for today is titled A Praxis for an Unsettled Witnessing in These Migratory Times. Our last speaker today will be Susan Lee, who received her JD in 1995. Susan Lee is the Senior Advisor on Public Safety to Chicago Mayor Lightfoot, and she's also the Chief Strategy and Policy Officer at Chicago CREED, an affiliated organization to the Emerson Collective. She recently served as the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety for the City of Chicago. Prior to this, Ms. Lee worked as a social justice advocate in multiple cities, working on issues of immigrant rights, racial equity, community safety, violence reduction, and police reform. Ms. Lee is also the co-author of the 2007 A Call to Action, which is a blueprint for violence reduction in Los Angeles. That blueprint was embraced by the city and implemented over the last 13 years, which has led to significant reductions in violence and improved police-community relations. The title of her talk today is Violence, Policing, and Racial Equity. Welcome to our three speakers. I will go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Tu Quoc.
So thank you again. It is such a pleasure to be here, especially as someone who graduated from UC Berkeley as an undergrad and then came back for my PhD in epidemiology. And again, I'm going to be talking about the work that we do at Asian Health Services, which is a community health center located in Oakland, Chinatown, not too far from UC Berkeley. So Asian Health Services was founded in 1974. And key to all of this was that it was founded by UC Berkeley students who came from the community and saw that their parents and their communities were not being served, that they needed health care, but because of language barriers, they were not going to see the doctor. The community health center movement came out of the civil rights. So a lot of those same principles around communities of color, around justice, were really embedded in how we do our work. Today, 46 years later, we are serving 50,000 patients with really a focus on cultural and linguistic competency. We provide excellent services in medical, dental, and behavioral health. But it's not just the services. We know that we need to advocate for our communities because the systems that were set up really do not serve us. It's really racially biased against many communities of color. So it's important that not only were we providing the services, but that we really were trying to push back on the system that really made things so unequal across all of the communities. And built within us is the accountability. On our board of directors, we have 51% or more of patients serving on that. So they get the say in how we run our organization. So I want to say that COVID hit all of us pretty hard, and it was no different for our community. That before COVID began, for 2+ years, we fought against one of the most anti-immigrant policies, the public charge rule change, that really was focusing on how people, penalizing people for using healthcare, housing, and food assistance. And that there were attacks that were going on even before, right when COVID was coming out, really blaming the Asian American communities and Chinese for that. And we saw that the restaurants really closed down in the Chinatown, and then basically our communities were going underground, afraid. There were chilling effects from a lot of the anti-immigrant policies that even focus on, if people were eligible for things like for unemployment, they just were not using a lot of these services. We saw the rise in Asian American anti-hate that was going on, and that was really hard in terms of the documented cases of anti-Asian hate. But we know that there are many, many that were underreported, and it was really hard for us in our community to watch all of this happen to even our own staff and our patients. People being spat on, people being hit and blamed, and they were really afraid to come out. At the same time, the data was just non-existent. That model minority myth, as if we had no issues, our cases were really low, really painted us as if we had no impacts around COVID. A study that came out from UCSF, led by Dr. Teng Nguyen and his staff, really focused that actually among the cases of COVID, the Asians were dying from COVID at a higher level than some of the other ones, some of the general population. And this really speaks to the lack of testing, or late to presentation, or the fact that there were comorbidities that existed in our community that were just not being highlighted. In our Alameda County, where we're based, we saw that while the cases and deaths were not as high for us, when we looked at the data on who was getting tested, we were the lowest. And yet none of this was coming out in our county about the disparity in access. So what did Asian Health Services do? We knew that we were hearing stories. We knew that no one was collecting the data. So we set forth to collect our own survey. And in all of that, we collected over 1,300 surveys from mostly our patients. You see here the results of many from who are Chinese, identified as being Chinese. Half of them were not fluent in English, and over 80% of them were foreign born. And the results of the survey really told us what we knew was happening, that only 3% of them were getting tested compared to the county rates of 10% or more in other communities of color. That when we asked them why they were not getting tested, a lot of them were saying that they couldn't find a place to get tested. We also asked them about mental health, and 25% of the 1,300 or so that responded actually said that they were experiencing depression, and 75% on stress. And then when we asked about what they were doing to limit their exposures, 73% of them were not leaving their house, even for grocery shopping. This really speaks to how they were going underground and hiding. We were able to use the data, because data can be power for us, to push back and ask the county to fund us in launching the first ever Asian American and Pacific Islander testing site that was free for everyone in the area. And that started in mid-August. We're testing about 300 people per day, 1,100 per week. So it's a huge game changer. And then now we are starting the first multilingual contact tracing. All of that is how do we use data and really hear the stories of our patients so that we could push back on the system that was ignoring them. I wanted to share quickly some stories. We had one person who is Vietnamese American who tested, but he didn't speak the language. When we called him, we found out that his wife had a COVID, but she was isolated, but would come out to cook for the family because that's what you do in these families, and yet it was infecting them. So we were able to bring in care for them. Another patient of ours who was HIV positive, we found out he was sharing a room with his elderly parents. And so we had to quickly respond by getting him isolation housing. All of these things would be missed if Asian Health Services and other community organizations are not around to respond to our community's needs. And really the key to our work has been really pushing back to make sure that our communities are not simultaneously blamed and yet overlooked for the COVID services. I want to end by saying that it was important for us to do this work and to really shift the narrative around communities, Asian American communities. And I'm happy to say that we just released our big One Nation report that really gives you a lot around experiencing COVID, the dual pandemic of both COVID and racism that's happening in this community. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having me. It's such an honor to be here. As was conveyed in the introduction, today I'm going to be talking about a praxis for an unsettled witnessing in these migratory times. Here I am thinking about immigration and the question of witnessing immigration today in 3 acts. And so the first act I will talk about is the act of containment. The second one will be border securitization, and the third one will be the act of exclusions. Much of today's conversation or brief reflections is informed by my work published in my book, Migrant Crossings, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the United States, where I invite the reader to to think about and think through questions that include the following that I think are relevant generally for conversations around immigration, which include what is a consequence of witnessing transnational migration through normative views? What are the subjectivities migrants are bound to that shape their visibility? And here, I think in my book, as well as in other work, around the concept of what I call a tethered subjectivity, which is the discursive, socio-legal practices and visual implications of constructing migrants through a duality of dangerous criminal or helpless victim. And the last question I invite us all to think through is what sort of witnessing is required for the witness to see beyond the dualities that construct who counts as a person who experiences violence. So when we think about this question of witnessing, I'm thinking about witnessing in a multifaceted way. So here I think of witnessing as encompassing the self-witness, the account of events, the witnessing of the process of witnessing, and the witness as non-human. Much of my work is drawing upon the work of Maria Lugones, who talks about witnessing on the side of the oppressed. And so here I invite us all to enact what I call an unsettled witnessing, which is the witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing, raising questions about normative aspects of events, paying attention to performances in institutions, and examining the politics of representation. And so to turn to the first act of containment, we're all familiar with the executive order enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States, which is an act of containing migrants and communities. This particular executive order did so and does so through the language of responding to sanctuary cities. And in thinking about this policy, I'm reflecting on the community interviews that I did in 2018. And what I found is that communities in the Bay Area were experiencing a discourse of fear. And here we hear from an immigration attorney that says, regardless of all the protections and laws and regulations that make us a sanctuary jurisdiction, people are telling us they're afraid to send their children to school, they're afraid to go to work, they're afraid to seek medical care, they're afraid to go to court. So that has been another overarching theme that's been really difficult. And so what we know is that a discourse of fear circulated even before pandemic, and that we find that migrant communities were hiding in place. Here I offer an example of a Latina migrant who disclosed to me about how she was literally locking herself in her home and afraid to open the door, and did have a pocket card that she would share she shared with me and with others that would share her practice of, if somebody did come, that she would then disclose that it was her Fifth Amendment right to not respond. And so I've been on a journey to understand the multiplicity in migrant experiences and how policy and practices create insecurity. There's a range of insecurities we can think through, which include food, housing access, as well as violence in general. And the list goes on when I was interviewing and have been interviewing communities. Here I offer an example of an Asian migrant survivor of violence who said, "It's very hard to rent a place. A lot of landlords will not rent to you a single parent with kids. They'll see you and sometimes they won't even talk to you, or they'll hang up on you." And so here I was listening to Asian migrants talking about harassment, feeling unsafe, having an access to important resources, and even a place to call home. And that while there were a range of resources that were available to them, they continue to experience barriers. And so to understand the containment of migrants in a country's interior is to grapple with the rhetorical strategies and practices that further a discourse of danger and fear, which impacts the Asian American community and Asian community. The Act 2 is securitization of the border. And this is in particular an example that we see through the executive order around border security and immigration enforcement improvements. And this is where we're seeing a specific response to our physical borders. And when we look at the response to the borders, it has implications for all of our communities: Asian, Latinx, Black, Brown, Indigenous. And we know that there are examples of Asians that have been detained at the border. And there's examples that the South Asian Americans Leading Together offers an example of somebody who was on a hunger strike and they were demanding for their rights to seek asylum in the United States. But one of the things that I think this goes back to what Dr. Kwok was framing is that when we have the model minority myth that gets perpetuated about our communities, then it makes it very difficult to see the complexities within them. That we know that when we think about undocumented America, the common discursive practice is to think about Latinx communities, when we know that the undocumented communities are very diverse, including Asian, whites, and Blacks. And that the countries that people are migrating from when they are entering undocumented or unauthorized includes a range of countries such as Korea, China, Philippines, Vietnam, India, and so forth. And so in my work, I think through this, and I think through the example of Kyung Jackie Roberts, who was known as the Dallas Madam, who went from being a military bride to eventually trafficking people into sexual economies. But one of the things that was very poignant about her story is the way that she was described regards to territoriality and border security and the US economy, in which she was also positioned as a threatening figure who was moving bodies across state borders as well as across international borders, both the Canadian and the US-Mexico border, which again goes back to some of the images that we see continuing to haunt Asian American and Asian diaspora communities that construct us in dualities of dangerous or lotus blossoms. And the last act that I won't go into very much detail, I think Dr. Kwok did a wonderful job of framing this for us, is that of exclusions that continues to haunt and impact Asian migrant communities and Asian diasporas and the communities that we come from. And so what sort of practice is necessitated to witness communities for their complexity? And so to close, what I would like us to think about is that in the face of struggle and unsettled witnessing enables calls to action that facilitate transnational, localized, and multidisciplinary collaborations that facilitate responses to the plurality and multiplicity of migrant, Asian American, and Asian diasporic communities. And so I offer just a couple of examples in my own work that I've been doing, which is collaborating with alumni of Berkeley's Ethnic Studies program, in which we created the Institute of Impossible Subjects, where we work collaboratively with artists, scholars, and activists from around the world to engage in pedagogical discussions, research collaborations, and exhibits, and so actual physical exhibits, where we engage in conversations around migration and migration in its broadest sense. But also I have localized my work in thinking through a relational issue of gender-based violence, in which I started the Gender-Based Violence Consortium at the University of Utah, which has a goal of thinking through research, innovation, and collaboration across disciplines. And so we're bringing folks in the medical field together with the humanities, social scientists, and interdisciplinary scholars. And we're also doing a domestic violence study on COVID-19 and how COVID-19 shelter-in-place policies impacted domestic violence survivors and response. And so I really want to invite us all to then engage and think about the role of the scholar and our opportunities in our research to inform community practice. And I see in my colleagues that they're doing this, but it also can be the work of the scholar in academia. And so I've taken my work into community-based research, as well as utilizing my public intellectualism for public service, including providing expert witness reports and expert witness testimony in court systems for immigration, civil, and criminal needs, as well as continuing to draw upon the field of ethnic studies in which we utilize curricular methodologies in which is a handy person who uses the tools available to them to answer a research question. And so that was my cue to myself that I am done. I thank you and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Fukushima. We now have Susan Lee.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I don't have pretty slides. I'm gonna just walk through my journey in this work that I have been on for now many decades. I'm gonna probably date myself by giving a little bit of the genesis of how I came to be a social justice advocate in the field of violence reduction and public safety. While I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, I was heavily involved in the work around human rights and political prisoners. And then as I was doing my JD and graduate studies work in ethnic studies, the '92 LA civil unrest happened. And that changed the way I decided to really work on issues of transformation and change. And it really brought a bent around structural racism within the United States. It was truly complicated around police brutality that led to the civil unrest with the beating of Rodney King, but really also the mainstream media framing of the events as a Black Korean conflict. And so my consciousness around structural racism really began to crystallize around that. I took my work around racial coalition building into the community and have been there really ever since. For a long period of time, I spent a lot of my work around advocacy for immigrant rights, immigrant justice, but also around building institutions of high quality, because what is true about structural racism is that communities of color do not get access to high quality institutions. And so I worked on services of all kinds, mental health, health services, but also built a charter school, built a preschool, all in the pursuit of building quality institutions for communities who are neglected, marginalized, and underserved. And then I really got an opportunity in 2006, as you heard, to participate in a groundbreaking work to develop a blueprint around gang violence reduction in LA with a eminent civil rights attorney, Connie Rice. And we produced a report which came to be embraced by the city. And in that year-long process and the 11 years of work that followed, I came to understand violence as really the most urgent of rights to be secured, or safety is the most urgent rights to be secured, because without safety, no other outcomes are possible for anyone, but particularly those living with violence every day of every year. And we all know these communities, the violence is kind of concentrated in urban centers in the communities of color, poor communities of color, and largely affect Black and brown young men. And this is true of LA, this is true of Oakland, this is true of Chicago, this is true everywhere. And so we produced a blueprint that looked at violence reduction from a public health framework, and really questioned the issue of policing, which sort of led to a stream of work with LAPD around police reform. And those had some great results. I mean, we saw a 35% decline in gang violence reduction in LA first 5 years. We also saw actually that officers were safer by going this route of a public health approach, because there was a 48% reduction of assaults on an officer with a deadly weapon in those places where this public health approach on violence reduction was taking place. And really one of the core elements of this approach was to recruit former gang members who had been really involved in street life to become peacemakers. They're called gang intervention in LA, they're called street outreach in Chicago. Whoever they are, this was a reclaiming of individuals who are leaders in the community in their own right, but to asking them to become a different kind of a leader in their own community, from a gang leader into a peacemaker. So I took all that, and fast forward in 2016, Chicago experienced a true violence crisis after the police shooting of Laquan McDonald and the ensuing civil unrest that happened. So in 2016, there were 780 plus homicides. We had 4,000 plus shootings. And so as a person devoted to the idea of safety for communities, I sort of flew into Chicago, you might say, and began work here, working with street outreach workers, Black and brown in the city. And, you know, in comparison to LA, for example, which is relatively safe now, Chicago is 3 times more homicides than LA does, and 6 times more than New York. And if Chicago wanted to be as safe as LA, we would have to have about 150 homicides. And this year in 2020, we are on schedule to hit about 750 homicides. We are at 620 now and 2,000 plus shootings. So you can imagine the scale of violence that is going on every day in the streets of Chicago. Then as I was doing this work, Mayor Lightfoot was elected, and she asked me to come and serve as her deputy mayor. And I cannot tell you that I could have imagined the 1.5 years that I would spend in that role would be faced with such really historical challenges with COVID, a global pandemic, and a ginormous spike in violence. And so if you can imagine, the last 3 years in Chicago, we had a really on pace to reduce violence every year by about 15%. And this year we've had 50% increase in homicides and shootings. And so compared to last year, we are in a different place in terms of violence. And then certainly the murder of George Floyd and the largely righteous protests that also have been followed by looting and other types of, civil unrest has created unprecedented conditions for somebody to be in charge of public safety in the third largest city of the country. And I think what I took away from this experience last 15 months is that evermore, the truth is clear, right? It is not by accident that more Black and brown Chicagoans are being diagnosed and dying from COVID. It is not by accident that 80% of the homicide victims are African-American men between the ages of 17 and 49. And it is not by accident that these communities also suffer from 30+% unemployment, lack of stable housing, lack of access to healthcare and mental health access. So in Chicago, this problem, probably more than anywhere else, any other urban centers in the country, is exacerbated by decades of segregation and segregation policies that have accentuated. We have many places within Chicago that is 99% African-American or 99% Latino. This is unheard of in most urban centers in these days, where we've had much more diverse integration happening, although as you know, this is the level of segregation might be more intense in Chicago. It is still true in a lot of urban centers. And so we came to devise a strategy around COVID that melded the violence reduction strategy with COVID. And so we really asked those street outreach peacemakers to reach those who are at the highest risk of violence with COVID information, making them from peacemakers to public health workers. We've done other things we've formed a racial equity rapid response team, which really targets the COVID response in Black and brown communities throughout Chicago. But it hasn't been enough to really equalize or create equity, I guess, in terms of the disproportionate impact of COVID. And violence continues to ravage the communities on the South and the West Side, which are predominantly African-American in Chicago. So in these challenging times, I think we have to confront the systemic racism that has led to these horrible outcomes that we're seeing now. And we must at the same time address the issue of police brutality and the need for police reform, because police are in fact committing acts of violence in communities that are also experiencing violence within the community and among themselves. And so faced with those multiple systemic needs for change, I think that we have to focus on issues of root conditions and systemic racism and not put forth short-term Band-Aid solutions. And I think this is the task for the country ahead, not only this year, beyond the pandemic, ongoing. I will share one personal aspect of this, which has been challenging, and it is a unique thing for this field of violence reduction and public safety. So I have to say, for the years that I've been involved in this work, I've always been challenged as that short Asian woman, and what could she possibly know about violence and about policing? And so the idea of a short Asian woman having credibility in the field of violence reduction and police reform has continued to confront me at multiple fronts. And not the least of which from the Black and brown communities that I seek to serve. And so that is the complexity of race in the US. And while I meet the challenge every day, I do have to say at a personal level, it does make you pause as you're on a mission. So I'm gonna stop there and pass it back to Locke.
Thank you so much. Susan, thank you so much, Annie, and thank you so much too for your wonderful presentations. All of you covered such different areas of our social life right now. You know, all of them are also equally important and influential in the effects on Asian American communities. And it's so critical for us to hear all these aspects, you know, around the pandemic, around migration issues, and around racial equity. I'll be moderating the Q&A, and there are a few questions from our audience members. And let me go ahead and begin one question to all of you, actually, around the work that you're doing really crosses the racial lines. You know, it isn't just about Asian Americans, but really, you know, how it impacts Latinx, Indigenous, African American communities. And, you know, I wanted to hear a bit more from all of your work in terms of, you know, the coalition building, you know, how, you know, working across these lines with different communities. How do you engage with these communities of color? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities, you know, in working, you know, across communities? So anyone want to take this on first?
I'm happy to start. I would say that there's two parts to my response. When COVID hit, it was a lot, and we saw our communities go underground. And then all of the protests happened after George Floyd, and our communities responded in how they knew, which is fear and wanting more policing. And even our staff of 500 had a lot of misconceptions about other communities and what the protests meant to them, and not really understanding why there would be protests. And I would say that even the stories from our patients, it was triggering a lot of their own experiences of immigration, of homeland violence that they've experienced. And so we didn't want to deny that, but it was important as a community health center to really push on the racial justice issue. And I have to say that the work begins at home. And for us, it was a hard work. We're just beginning on what it means to talk to our staff and our patients about the history, the civil rights history, that what we have gained as a community from our Black brothers and sisters and that. And it was really telling because a lot of them had not heard that story. They had not even understood the solidarity that we had in building Asian Health Services through Black Panther history of solidarity. And this is why it's important to keep telling those stories, because those stories matter in the understanding that we should not be pitted against each other, that we should not as a community be the wedge. And I think that we are still figuring out how to do it because there is a lot of stuff that comes up, but we have started those conversations and will continue to work with others. The second part is around the COVID. And sorry, I just want to finish. The piece is that in COVID, what it does is that it only highlighted the disparities that exist and the injustices that exist. And it's continuing to pit our communities against each other. We are constantly fighting to see, by definition of cases and death, who has it worse. And it is still a zero-sum game. That when we say that we need resources for our community, it should not be at the expense of the Latinx community. It should not be at the expense of the Black community. And yet it is framed in that way. And I think it's important that we figure out together on how to push back on that narrative. And I think in the simplest way that you can have testing sites in multiple communities and it does not take away from each other. It's simple as that. But I think it's an ongoing battle that we'll have to figure out and how to push back on the zero-sum narrative that's being placed upon us.
I just wanted to say that I think that in my training from ethnic studies at Berkeley, and I think that the work of our professors here also illuminates that, is that the very nature of Asian American and Asian diaspora studies is one of relationality and interconnectedness with a range of communities. I'm a Corexicana or Korean Mexican scholar, Asian Latina. And so when we think about who is Asian American, I think it's very complex. What counts as Asian American is very complicated and can encompass a range of experiences. But to answer the question about how we go about doing the work of relationality, of connecting. It's ongoing. And I think that one of the things that it's also context-based. So now I live in Utah, in a predominantly white state, working in a predominantly white institution, where when we think about the history of Latinx communities, indigenous communities, and also Asian resettlement and Black resettlement to Utah, it's, there are diverse, there are communities of color. And so the work for me has been quite, I think, interesting and ongoing. And I've learned to speak differently to different audiences, because I found that, I think, as Dr. Kwok was framing, is that people come at these issues with different knowledge base and different entry points and different histories. And so I've been learning a ton from my context of Utah, of enacting witnessing. And one of the things that I've also been doing is following organizations across the country that are working with housing and access. So I've been meeting with folks. I met with folks in New Orleans. I met with folks in South Dakota, and I've been working with folks in California and across the United States. And I think that it's been really exciting to work across different communities and to learn from them. So then I can be a better researcher, a practitioner in my pedagogies and so forth. And so that's just to respond to that.
I guess I would just add, from my perspective of working on community violence, I see divisions within communities, right? So even in the Black community or the brown communities, there's the tendency to say, here are the good folks in the community and here are the bad folks in the community. And I think that's what I reject, right? Which is that I think even within communities, that we cannot marginalize the folks who are at the highest risk of violence and not care that they are being shot and being killed. That until we can see community as a whole and have solutions for the whole communities, we are leaving something behind, and will come back really to undermine our overall wealth and well-being. And so in some ways, being that short Asian woman who's alien in the African-American or Latinx community helps me to make that point, because I am obviously not from that community and not aligned with the good people or the bad people. And I can make that argument that those who are being shot should also be cared for. So that's my sort of addition to all the great things that's already been said.
Thank you for those answers. There are a few more from our audience members, but I also wanted to ask a question around the structural positions of Asian Americans, in relation to African Americans and Latinx and Indigenous peoples. All of you have mentioned sort of the exaggerated disparities, that are highlighted. And do you see also, more dialogue, more conversation, since the occurrences of this year? Has there been much more of a working together, kind of spirit, in all this? From where you're standing in your various fields, what is being done across the communities?
I'll start. I think, unfortunately, I'm not seeing that from my vantage point. I mean, I think that folks have retreated back to their places. I mean, one thing we did see, that the difference between the protests this year and protests, let's say, of '92, was that this was a much more multi-generational and multiracial representation among those who came out to protest the murder of George Floyd. But I didn't see cohesive organizing across race. So there was an expression of solidarity, but I'm not sure that there is a cohesive organizing across race and generations. I also think that to some degree, as the economy tanks, as many places, Chicago included, are experiencing ginormous deficits resulting from COVID impact, and the federal aid is not forthcoming, there is this sense that there's only so much to go around, that the pie is very small, and we must fight for our own fair share. And and obviously we are in Chicago government is in the middle of our budget cycle right now. And so that is very clear in terms of, what is ours, what is yours, and everybody's fighting for what might be a very small pie. And so, I'm not seeing that. I hope we rise above that. I hope the elections show us a different spirit of coming together, because we really need a different way of doing business in this country. But from my perspective, we are still in very much a self-preservation mode.
I think we've been seeing a lot of Asians for Black Lives too, though. And I think that there's been a lot of awareness in, materials and translated languages to how do you start the conversations in your home. And so I do want to acknowledge that, yes, while the work, it is difficult, I do agree, Susan, and I think that there's much to be done. I do think that Black Lives Matter movement did spark important conversations in some families, maybe not all. And I think that young folks that I'm seeing on social media are really trying to engage with these questions. So I do want to acknowledge that, that it might be happening, but maybe in ways that don't feel fast enough. And that's because, as we've learned from social movements, is that it's for the long haul and that the change can be slow.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. I do think that the younger generation are pushing their parents, and we are hearing even the mental health that's coming up when they have these arguments from our own patients. But it's true, it's not systematic. I feel like we're still siloed in our approach, and mostly what I see is, there is a recognition that right now the issues that affect the Black community needs to take center stage, but I'm not sure there's a full embracing of that. And then how would that come out? How would that play through when we hit the recession that's coming right away?
Thank you. We have one question from our audience member regarding your experience in Berkeley, how your experience in the classroom as Asian American, Asian diaspora studies students and in ethnic studies influence the work that you do, as well as the extracurricular activities that you might have been involved in, might have shaped your work trajectory. So we will go ahead and take that question for all three of you.
Maybe I'll start first. I think I'm the most latest alumni. But yeah, I actually, I have to say I loved my Berkeley, and I'm not saying this because I was invited. I genuinely loved my experience at Berkeley. I think that one of the things I remember when I applied to graduate school, I was told by my mentor, who was also alumni, that it's a throw you to the wolves program. So I learned that going into a PhD program would not be easy, and I didn't come in with that sort of belief that it would be easy. But through the struggle of what it means to be somebody who is for the first time learning what it's like to go through a PhD program, I created and was fostered through my faculty mentors to create community with my peers. And so there were different working groups that I was involved in that led to us collaborating with the Visuality and Alterity Working Group with San Francisco Art Institute. And so stuff like that happened, as well as it has now fostered these long-term collaborations with my colleagues. And so I think for myself, it was really amazing to be a student. I also went in community and worked. And so I was working as a caseworker and a programs coordinator. And that really was important for my thinking about practice. And so I think that was just something that I felt like I was surrounded by, that I could be participating in all these communities that in University of Utah, I have to now create it for my students, where I created a Women of Color Academics Collective to foster the same kind of community that was so readily there that I could just dive into in Berkeley that isn't so readily available in other contexts.
I'll go next. I want to say that I first took Professor Omi's class in Asian American Studies, and it was such an awakening for me, as a Vietnamese refugee, not really being able to contextualize my experiences. And then when I took Professor Ohm's class, that was really the next level of understanding where I fit into all of that. I think for my undergrad, it was really important But it was also my own lived experience of coming here as a refugee, as a person who was a child interpreter for my parents to the healthcare system that really made me want to go into public health. And then unfortunately, my mom had worked as a hair and nail salon worker and died of cancer. And so that led me back to do my PhD in public health. And I think it really is important that we tell our stories and that we anchor ourselves in the lived experience of our family. I can't say that enough because there is so much strength in our communities, and the work that we do really, it's unfortunate that it comes from so much pain, but it also drives so much of the power and empowerment that we see in generations to come. And I've been fortunate enough to have done a lot of health studies on nail salon workers and really changing policies and such, but all of it came from my own lived experience. But what Berkeley did was it helped me become politicized to understand how to take that to the next level. Because without it, I think I would have just gone into some other traditional field. But I think Berkeley really helped me feel like I wanted to do something different with the experiences that I had.
Thank you. Susan?
So I'm probably the oldest person of the three. And I think when I was there, it was a bit of a different kind of environment. However, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I went to Yale Law School and then came back to Boalt Hall to finish my degree. And really, ethnic studies and Asian American studies, really more than ethnic studies, gave me a foundation and a home where I could explore being an organic intellectual. And so that meant for me the ability to be an activist in the community. I was given the opportunity to teach Korean American studies for many, many years, and got to mentor, you know, hundreds of Korean American students, and was a TA to Michael Omi and, you know, many of the revered leaders of Asian American studies movement. And so all of those experiences have allowed me to continue on the path of being an organic intellectual, which I think means that you are, you must do things, but you must also be thoughtful as you're doing them, and that it must be rooted in a philosophy of racial equity and confront the injustice that are out there. So that will always be part of who I am.
Thank you all. We just have a couple minutes left, but I do want to give you a chance to give us sort of a you know, your last word on what action, you know, can we take? What concrete action can we take, you know, moving forward? If you could share with us, you know, what you think is the most important moving forward at this moment.
I think people have to vote, you know, we have to change the circumstances that we're under. So that's one. But I would ask, and I'm assuming many folks who are on this Zoom are younger folks, is that it is very important to be an active citizen, right? That you cannot just be on your own. You have to be out there trying to impact the world in the best way that you can see fit. And I can't imagine living in America without having an understanding of structural racism, because that is fabric of who we are and how we live in this country. So I ask that folks become a aware and active citizen and do the right thing. And to do that, I think the first thing they got to do is go vote.
I would agree. And I would say that for me, so 4 years ago, I was part of a group that started the Progressive Vietnamese American Organization, a C4, with the intent of changing the course of our nation at this election. And we have been working with the Vietnamese American community to deal with the misinformation that is prevalent in our community and really pushing back on the narrative that is going on. I would say that it's not just voting. Voting is the first step. It's whoever gets elected. We've got to continue to hold them accountable. I don't see an end to this. That the country is at the state it is because we did not get engaged enough, and we have not really changed the systems that we're working under. So the end is not the election. That is just the beginning.
Yeah, and I agree with both of that. And I think that just to add is that I think that one of the things that I've been witnessing in our communities is that because of COVID-19, the current political climate, racism, and the list goes on, a lot of our communities' mental wellness, health, and emotional well-being has been very much impacted. And so I think that one of the things that I would encourage all of you to enact is how do we connect with each other in empathetic ways that also seek to enter the world of the other without continuing to other them, and then also to recognize that coalitional work is messy, it's difficult, and it's for the long haul. And so I really encourage folks to connect with each other in empathetic ways and also to be in struggle with each other.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you, Dr. Kwak, Professor Fukushima, Ms. Lee, for wonderful presentations. And thank you for the audience for your participation in your chat. I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague and my esteemed colleague. Everyone has mentioned his name here, Professor Michael Omi, who has a few announcements for us. He is he will be the new chair for the Asian American Research Center. Michael.
Oh, thank you, Locke. What a terrific panel. You know, it's pretty evident that this insightful panel is really part of a broader conversation, a longer, more sustained conversation that we need to be having. A conversation about how different Asian American groups are situated with respect to race, racism, and racial justice in the United States and indeed the world. We're going to be foregrounding issues of relevance to Asian American communities by nurturing, initiating, supporting interdisciplinary research through a new Asian American Research Center. And I want to invite you to join us next Friday, October 23rd, from 2 to 3 for the virtual launch of the Asian American Research Center. It's going to feature a very timely and intriguing presentation by Taegu Lee, a professor of law and political science here at Berkeley, who's going to draw upon new data to look at the Asian American millennial and Generation Z vote in 2020. So I hope you join us for that. I do want to thank all of our panelists for their excellent presentations. I want to thank also the technical and support staff that really made this all possible. And I do want to thank you for joining us in this venture. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.